Dan stepped off his small cargo ship and stretched his arms. The space station was old, its metal walls covered in layers of rust and grime. Neon signs flickered, advertising all kinds of goods, most of which were probably illegal. The air smelled like oil, fried food, and something Dan couldn't quite place. Maybe some alien spice. This was just another stop for him. Deliver the supplies, refuel, and get out. Nothing special. He walked through the crowded market, his boots clicking against the metal floor. Aliens of all shapes and sizes moved past him. Some ignored him, others gave him cautious glances. Humans were still rare in deep space. People either respected them, feared them, or didn't know what to think of them. Dan didn't mind. He wasn't here to make friends. He was passing a row of vendors when it happened. A sudden weight hit his side, almost knocking him over. He turned in shock to see a woman, a strange, alien woman, clinging to his arm. Her skin shimmered like polished stone, shifting between shades of blue and silver under the station's dim lights. She had 4 arms, all wrapped around him as if she was afraid he would disappear. Her golden eyes were wide with fear, and her whole body trembled. And then, to Dan's complete shock, she started crying. Loud, desperate sobs. The market grew quiet. People stopped to stare. Some backed away. Others whispered among themselves. Dan raised his hands, trying to show he wasn't attacking her. Hey, what's wrong? I think you've got the wrong guy. The woman shook her head violently, her grip tightening. Please, she choked out. Her voice was soft, shaking, and desperate. Please, don't leave. I beg you. Dan glanced around. The other aliens looked nervous. Some turned and hurried away, as if they wanted no part in whatever was happening. That made him even more uneasy. I don't even know you, Dan said carefully, lowering his voice. Who are you? What's going on? The woman tried to speak, but another sob escaped her lips. She buried her face in his shoulder, still clinging to him, as if letting go would mean death. Dan sighed. He wasn't great with emotional situations, especially when they involved aliens crying on him. He glanced at a nearby vendor, a short, furry creature with 4 eyes. What's her deal? Dan asked. The vendor gave him a nervous look. If I were you, human, I'd leave now, before it's too late. Dan frowned. Too late for what? Before the vendor could answer, the station's loudspeakers crackled to life. A deep mechanical voice boomed across the market. Attention, all inhabitants. Be advised. A fugitive has been reported on this station. Any individual caught aiding them will face severe consequences. Report any suspicious activity immediately. The market froze. Silence filled the air. The alien woman tensed against him. Her fingers dug into his jacket. Dan put the pieces together instantly. She was the fugitive. And now, by standing here with her, so was he. Dan sighed. Well, that's just great. Dan felt every eye in the market on him. The alien woman still clung to his arm, her body trembling. The station's announcement had changed everything. A fugitive, severe consequences. That meant trouble, big trouble. Dan knew one thing about deep space stations. No one helped fugitives. It didn't matter if they were innocent or guilty. If the wrong people were after you, no one would risk their own neck to save yours. He sighed. Look, lady, I don't know who you are, but if you don't let go, we're both gonna be in serious trouble. The alien woman, Alina, as he would soon learn, lifted her face. Her golden eyes shimmered with desperation. Please, she whispered, you are human. You are the only one who can help me. Dan frowned. What does that even mean? Before she could answer, movement caught his eye. A group of armored figures entered the market. Their black suits gleamed under the flickering lights. They moved with military precision, scanning the crowd with glowing red visors. The moment they arrived, the market changed. Vendors looked away, pretending to be busy. Shoppers backed into the shadows. The entire station seemed to hold its breath. Dan felt Alina tighten her grip. He could feel her heartbeat racing. Vorgith, she whispered, terror in her voice. Dan had heard that name before. The Vorgith were feared across the galaxy. They weren't just slavers. They were hunters. Once they marked someone, that person was as good as caught. The fact that they were here meant Alina wasn't just in trouble. She was in serious trouble. One of the Vorgith soldiers stopped a few feet away. His visor glowed as he scanned the area. Dan's instincts screamed at him to leave. He didn't need this. He could step away, pretend he saw nothing, and walk out. But then he glanced at Alina. She wasn't just scared. She was terrified. Dan had seen that kind of fear before, in war zones, in refugee camps, in places where people had lost everything. She wasn't just running. She was begging for her life. Dan swore under his breath. "All right, come on," he muttered. Alina looked up in shock. "What?" "I said, let's go." Dan pulled her toward a narrow alley between two market stalls. They slipped into the shadows just as the Vorgith turned their way. The moment they were out of sight, Dan pressed Alina against the wall. "Start talking. Why are they after you?" Alina struggled to catch her breath. "Because they fear humans." Dan blinked. "What?" She swallowed hard. "The Vorgith rule through fear. They conquer, they enslave, and no one fights back. But humans, you are different. You don't break. You don't surrender. To them, humans are the greatest threat in the galaxy. And any species that seeks your help." Her voice broke. "They destroy them." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. "They don't just want you," he realized. "They want to make an example out of you." Alina nodded. "If they catch me, my people are doomed." Dan rubbed his temples. This was getting worse by the second. He didn't know much about intergalactic politics, but one thing was clear. Alina was in more danger than he thought. And now, by helping her, so was he. Footsteps echoed nearby. The Vorgith were getting closer. Dan sighed. "Well, guess I'm in this now." Alina looked at him with hope in her eyes. "You will help me." Dan glanced toward the end of the alley. He could see an emergency exit leading to the lower levels of the station. It wasn't the best plan, but it was something. He exhaled. "Yeah, but let's get one thing straight. If we're doing this, we do it my way." Alina nodded quickly. "Good," Dan muttered. "Now let's get out of here before those guys find us." And with that, they disappeared into the depths of the station. Dan led Alina through the narrow corridors of the station, his mind racing. The market was too exposed. If the Vorgith were hunting her, it wouldn't take them long to search every corner of the upper levels. They needed a place to hide. Fast. The emergency exit had led them into the maintenance sector, a dimly lit maze of rusted pipes and flickering lights. The air smelled of burnt metal and leaking coolant. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being out in the open. Alina stayed close, her breathing unsteady. Dan could still feel her fear, but she didn't speak. He had 100 questions, but survival came first. They reached a dead end where an old supply room stood abandoned. Dan tried the door. It was locked. He pulled out a small multi-tool from his jacket, pried open the access panel, and rewired the controls. With a quiet beep, the door slid open. "Inside," he whispered. Alina hurried in, and Dan followed, sealing the door behind them. The room was small, filled with old crates and broken machinery. Dust floated in the air, but at least it was safe for now. Dan turned to her. "All right, no more running. Tell me everything." Alina hesitated, her golden eyes filled with sadness. "The Vorgith came to my world long ago. At first, they only watched. Then they demanded our resources. When we refused, they attacked." She swallowed hard. "They took our people. Thousands. No one ever returned." Dan's jaw tightened. He had heard stories of the Vorgith before, but he never knew the full extent of their cruelty. Alina continued, "We had no hope. No one stood against them. Until we learned about humans. Dan frowned. What do you mean? She took a deep breath. The Vorgeth fear your kind. They do not speak of you openly, but we have heard the whispers. Humans are different. You fight in ways no other species does. You do not surrender, even when the odds are against you. You win battles you should not be able to win. Dan smirked slightly. Yeah, that sounds like us. Alina stepped closer. I came here searching for a human. If I could find just one, I believed, maybe my people would have a chance. Dan exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about her. She was fighting for an entire species. Before he could respond, a loud noise echoed through the corridors outside. Heavy footsteps. The Vorgeth were near. Alina's hands clenched. They will not stop until they find me. Dan's mind worked fast. He was just one man against an entire squad of trained hunters. But if there was one thing he knew about humans, it was that they never played fair. He looked around the room and spotted an old ventilation shaft. It was small, but it might be their way out. Dan turned to Alina. You still trust me? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Good, he said, because we're not just going to hide. We're going to turn the tables on them. Alina looked at him in confusion. How? Dan grinned, the same way humans always do, by being unpredictable. The footsteps outside grew louder. The Vorgeth were close. Dan pulled Alina toward the vent, ready to make their next move. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the metal corridors outside. The Vorgeth were close. Their deep, mechanical voices spoke in a language Dan didn't understand, but he didn't need a translator to know what they were saying. They were hunting. Dan moved fast. He pulled open the vent cover and peeked inside. It was tight, but it would have to do. He turned to Alina. Get in. Now. Alina hesitated. But no time for questions. Move. She obeyed, squeezing into the narrow shaft. Dan followed, pulling the vent cover back into place just as the door to the supply room slid open. Through the small gaps in the metal, Dan saw them. 4 Vorgeth soldiers in black armor, their red visors glowing like hungry predators. They carried sleek, deadly weapons, scanning the room with slow, deliberate movements. One of them spoke in a deep, metallic voice. She is near. Dan held his breath. He could feel Alina shaking beside him. Another soldier approached the crates where they had been hiding minutes ago. He pressed a button on his wrist device, sending out a pulse of blue energy. It scanned the room, searching for life signs. Dan knew they had only seconds before the device found them. His mind raced. Hiding wasn't going to work for long. The Vorgeth were hunters. They had the best technology, the best tracking systems. But that was the thing about humans. They didn't rely on technology alone. They relied on something much harder to predict. Instinct. Dan took a deep breath and did something insane. He moved. With careful, silent movements, he crawled forward in the vent, making sure Alina followed. They needed to keep moving. Staying still meant death. The vent led them deeper into the maintenance sector. The air was thick with dust, and the metal walls groaned with age. It was risky, but Dan knew one thing. Old stations had weak spots, places where systems didn't work properly. If they could find one, the Vorgeth's fancy scanners wouldn't help them. After a few minutes, Dan spotted a loose panel ahead. He pushed it aside and dropped down into another room. Alina followed, landing softly beside him. They were in some kind of abandoned storage area. The lights flickered, and the air smelled stale. Alina turned to him, her golden eyes filled with worry. We cannot run forever. Dan leaned against the wall, catching his breath. I know. She hesitated before speaking again. Why? Why are you helping me? Dan looked at her. Because I've seen what happens when people don't fight back. His voice was calm, but firm. And because I don't like bullies. Alina studied him for a moment. Then she whispered, I was right about humans. Dan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She swallowed hard. The Vorgeth fear you. Not because you are stronger. Not because you have better weapons. Then why? She took a step closer. Because you refuse to break. Dan fell silent. She continued, her voice steady. Other species surrender when faced with impossible odds. They submit, they obey. But humans fight even when there is no hope. You are unpredictable, dangerous. That is why the Vorgeth want you gone. That is why they destroy any race that seeks your help. Dan clenched his fists. The idea of an entire species being wiped out just because they believed in humanity made his blood boil. The Vorgeth didn't just want Alina. They wanted to send a message. No one could stand with humans and survive. Dan exhaled. Well, they're about to learn something. Alina tilted her head. What? Dan smirked. Humans don't take kindly to threats. At that moment, alarms blared across the station. The Vorgeth were making their next move. Dan turned to Alina. Time to fight back. And with that, he started forming a plan. The alarms blared across the station, red warning lights flashing along the metal corridors. Dan knew what it meant. The Vorgeth were done searching. Now, they were locking down the station. Time was running out. He turned to Alina, who stood tense, her golden eyes scanning the room. We can't hide forever, she whispered. Dan nodded. Exactly. That's why we're not hiding. She frowned. Then what? We make them hunt the wrong target. Alina looked confused, but Dan was already moving. He grabbed a loose metal rod from the ground and smashed a nearby control panel. Sparks flew as the lights in the storage room flickered and died. Alina flinched. What are you doing? Dan grinned. Making noise. More alarms triggered, and a computerized voice echoed through the station. Warning. System malfunction detected in Sector 6. Dan tossed the metal rod aside. That'll get their attention. Alina's eyes widened. You want them to come here. Dan gave a half smile. Not just here. Everywhere. We're going to keep moving. Hit different systems. Make them think we're in 10 places at once. Alina hesitated. But there are only 2 of us. Dan winked. They don't know that. Before she could argue, he grabbed her wrist. Come on. We need to keep moving. They slipped back into the corridors. The air was thick with tension. Heavy boots echoed in the distance as the Vorgeth spread out, their voices sharp and commanding. Dan moved quickly, leading Alina through the maze of pathways. Every few minutes, he stopped to sabotage another panel, overloading circuits, shutting down security cameras, triggering emergency lockdowns in random sectors. Each time, the station blared new warnings. Power surge detected in Sector 9. Oxygen leak reported in Sector 3. Unauthorized access in Sector 12. The Vorgeth comms buzzed with confusion. Dan could hear them trying to coordinate, but their movements were growing erratic. They didn't know where to focus. It was working. Alina stared at him in awe. You are chaotic. Dan chuckled. Humans specialize in that. But they weren't safe yet. As they turned a corner, a red light flashed ahead. Dan pulled Alina back just in time. A pair of Vorgeth soldiers marched past, their glowing visors scanning every shadow. Dan held his breath. Alina clutched his sleeve, frozen in place. One of the soldiers paused, his visor tilting toward their direction. Dan's heart pounded. The soldier took a step closer, then another. Dan tightened his grip on his multi-tool, ready to fight if needed. Then, a new alarm blared over the speakers. Engine room compromised. Security override required. The soldier cursed in his own language, then turned away. Both Vorgeth rushed toward the disturbance, leaving the corridor empty once more. Dan let out a breath. That was close. Alina looked at him, her expression unreadable. How did you know that would happen? Dan shrugged. I didn't. She stared at him, then laughed softly. It was the first time he had seen her smile. Dan smirked. Welcome to humanity's greatest strategy. Improvise until something works. Alina shook her head in disbelief, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. Then her expression turned serious again. Dan, this will not stop them. They will keep searching until they find me. Dan knew she was right. Distractions could only do so much. They needed an escape plan. Fast. Dan glanced at the ceiling, spotting an old ventilation system running toward the lower levels of the station. He pointed up. That might lead to the docking bay. Alina's eyes filled with hope. You have a ship. Dan grinned. Yeah. And I'm thinking it's time we leave. But as they started toward the vent, a deep mechanical voice echoed behind them. Going somewhere, human. Dan turned. A Vorgoth commander stood in the hallway, his red visor glowing like fire. And he was not alone. Dan clenched his fists. The real fight was about to begin. Dan's body tensed as he faced the Vorgoth commander. The alien's black armor gleamed under the flickering station lights, and his red visor locked onto Dan like a predator eyeing its prey. Behind him, 3 more Vorgoth soldiers stood, their weapons humming with energy. Alina took a step back, fear in her golden eyes. The commander tilted his head, a human protecting an enemy of the Vorgoth. His voice was deep, metallic, and laced with amusement. Foolish. Dan smirked, hiding his nerves. Yeah, well, humans do a lot of foolish things, like fighting back when we should run. The commander chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. You think you can win? Dan didn't answer. Instead, he acted. In one swift motion, he grabbed a loose metal pipe from the ground and swung it toward a control panel beside him. Sparks exploded as the emergency lockdown system activated. The doors behind the Vorgoth slammed shut. The soldiers turned in surprise, just as Dan grabbed Alina's hand. Run. They sprinted down the corridor. The station alarm screamed louder, warning of security breaches. Behind them, the Vorgoth pounded on the locked doors, trying to override the system. Dan pulled Alina toward an emergency ladder leading to the lower levels. He climbed fast, pushing through the burning ache in his arms. Alina followed, moving quickly despite her fear. They reached a catwalk overlooking the docking bay. Below, rows of ships sat parked, their engines humming softly. Dan's ship, a battered but reliable freighter, was among them. There, Dan pointed. That's our way out. Alina exhaled in relief. We made it. Dan frowned. Not yet. A new problem stood between them and escape: station security. Dozens of station guards patrolled the area, scanning every ship. They weren't Vorgoth, but they answered to station law. And right now, Dan and Alina were fugitives. Alina looked at him. How do we get past them? Dan grinned. Simple. We cause more chaos. She sighed. Of course. Dan pulled out his multi-tool and hacked into a nearby control panel. Within seconds, warning lights flashed across the bay. Warning. Fuel leak detected. Evacuate docking area. The guards panicked. Some rushed to check the ships, while others ran for safety. Dan grabbed Alina's hand. Now's our chance. They ran across the catwalk, descending a ladder to the docking floor. Keeping low, they weaved between crates and fuel tanks, avoiding the distracted guards. Dan's ship was just ahead. The ramp was already down. They were almost there. Then, a gunshot rang out. Dan barely had time to react before a plasma blast struck the ground near his feet. He spun around. The Vorgoth had broken through. The commander stood on the catwalk above, his weapon aimed directly at them. His soldiers flanked him, their visors glowing like hungry predators. Alina gasped. They're fast. Dan gritted his teeth. Too fast. The commander's voice echoed through the bay. Enough games, human. Surrender, and I might let you live. Dan glanced at Alina. Her hands were clenched, her body trembling. She had fought so hard to escape. If they surrendered now, it was over. No. Dan tightened his grip on the metal pipe he still held. "You don't know much about humans, do you?" The commander's visor flashed. "What?" Dan smirked. "We don't surrender." Then he threw the pipe directly at a fuel tank. The explosion was instant. A massive fireball erupted across the docking bay, sending shockwaves through the station. Guards and soldiers scattered as flames roared through the area. Dan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Alina and ran for the ship. The heat burned against his back, but he didn't stop. They reached the ramp. Dan slammed the controls, sealing the doors behind them. "Strap in," he shouted, racing to the cockpit. Alina barely had time to sit before Dan hit the launch sequence. Engines roared to life. The ship lurched upward, breaking free from the station's docking clamps. Outside, the Vorgith fired at them, but it was too late. Dan grinned as the ship shot into space. "We're not out of this yet," Alina warned, gripping the seat. Dan's smirk widened. "Yeah, but at least now we got a fighting chance." The real battle had just begun. The ship rattled violently as Dan pulled the controls hard to the left, barely dodging an incoming plasma blast. The Vorgith weren't letting them go without a fight. Alina gripped the armrests of her seat, her golden eyes wide with fear. "They're following us." Dan spared a quick glance at the sensors. 3 Vorgith warships were in pursuit, their sleek, black hulls cutting through space like knives. They were gaining fast. "Yeah, I noticed," Dan muttered, flicking several switches on the dashboard. "Hang on, this is about to get rough." With a sharp yank on the throttle, the ship accelerated, engines roaring as they hurtled through the void. Stars blurred past the cockpit window as Dan pushed his freighter to its limits. Behind them, the warships fired another volley of plasma shots. Bright green energy streaked past, barely missing their hull. Alina gasped, "We won't survive a direct hit." Dan's hands flew over the controls. "Then I guess we won't get hit." He pulled the ship into a sudden, spiraling dive, weaving between chunks of floating debris left from an old space battle. The Vorgith followed, their weapons lighting up the wreckage around them. Alina watched the destruction with alarm. "They're not giving up." Dan gritted his teeth. "Yeah, but they made one mistake." Alina blinked. "What mistake?" Dan's eyes gleamed as he slammed a lever forward. They followed a human into an asteroid field. Ahead, a vast belt of asteroids stretched across space, massive rocks tumbling in every direction. It was a death trap for any normal pilot. But Dan wasn't a normal pilot. The ship shot into the asteroid field at breakneck speed. Dan twisted the controls, narrowly dodging giant spinning boulders. Some were as large as buildings, others as fast as missiles. Behind them, the Vorgith hesitated for a split second. Then they followed. Dan grinned. "Bad move, boys." The warships, larger and less maneuverable, struggled to keep up. One scraped against a jagged asteroid, its shields flickering from the impact. Another misjudged a turn and was smashed by a tumbling rock, exploding into flames. Alina's eyes widened. "It's working." Dan laughed, adrenaline surging. "Told you. Never chase a desperate human into a death trap." The last remaining Vorgith ship dodged the asteroids, adapting to the chaos. It was still locked onto them, firing relentlessly. A blast struck Dan's ship, sending sparks flying in the cockpit. Alina yelped as the entire vessel shook violently. "Shields down to 30%, she warned. Dan cursed. They wouldn't survive much longer at this rate. His mind raced. Think, improvise, find a way. Then he saw it. A massive asteroid, twice the size of a warship, slowly rotating ahead, with a deep crater at its center. Dan's grin returned. "Alina, trust me." She hesitated. "Do I have a choice?" "Not really." Dan yanked the controls, diving straight into the crater. Alina screamed as the ship plunged into the dark tunnel, the walls of the asteroid flashing past at terrifying speed. The Vorgith ship followed. Dan's hands were steady, his instincts sharp. He twisted, turned, dipped, navigating the tight, twisting path through pure instinct. The Vorgith weren't so lucky. Their ship was too large, too fast. When they tried to match Dan's movements, they clipped the rocky walls. Once, then twice. Dan saw his chance. At the last second, he veered upward, shooting out of the asteroid's surface. The Vorgith ship wasn't so lucky. It collided headfirst into a thick section of rock and exploded in a fiery blast. Alina gasped as the explosion lit up space behind them. We did it. Dan leaned back, letting out a breath. Told you I had a plan. She turned to him, shaking her head in disbelief. You are insane. Dan smirked. You say that like it's a bad thing. The alarms in the cockpit finally went silent. No more enemies. No more chasing ships. For the first time in hours, they were safe. Alina exhaled, shoulders relaxing. So, where do we go now? Dan gazed out at the stars, his expression turning serious. We find out why the Vorgith wanted you so badly. Because he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet. Dan set the ship on autopilot and leaned back in his chair. The chase was over. For now. The vast darkness of space stretched before them, peaceful yet unknown. Alina sat across from him, her golden eyes filled with exhaustion and worry. She had barely spoken since they escaped the asteroid field. Dan noticed. All right, he said, crossing his arms. Time to talk. Alina hesitated. About what? Dan raised an eyebrow. Don't play dumb. The Vorgith nearly tore apart a space station for you. They chased us across an asteroid field. You matter to them. Alina lowered her gaze. It's complicated. Dan sighed. Alina, I just risked my life saving you. I think I deserve to know why. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, Alina took a deep breath and whispered, I am the last heir of the Arcanus. Dan blinked. The what? She looked up at him. My people, the Arcanus, once ruled a vast empire, long before the Vorgith. We were peaceful, advanced, and strong. Dan leaned forward, listening closely. Alina continued, her voice heavy with sadness. But the Vorgith came. They wanted control of our technology, our knowledge. They attacked without warning, wiping out entire cities. My family, my entire race. They were hunted to extinction. Dan's chest tightened. You're saying you're the last one. She nodded. I was a child when it happened. A few loyal allies smuggled me away before the final battle. I have been hiding ever since. Dan ran a hand through his hair. So the Vorgith want to finish the job. Alina shook her head. It's worse than that. She hesitated, then pulled a small metallic disc from her pocket. It was no larger than a coin, glowing with faint blue light. This, she said, is why they want me. Dan frowned. What is it? Alina swallowed. It contains the coordinates of something ancient, something the Vorgith fear. Dan's curiosity grew. Fear. The Vorgith don't fear anything. Alina's voice was almost a whisper. They do, because it is the only thing that can destroy them. Dan stared at the disc. His gut told him this was big, very big. Where do the coordinates lead? He asked. Alina hesitated. To a lost Arcanus warship, one of the last of its kind. Dan whistled. And I'm guessing it's not just any ship. Alina nodded. It's a Titan-class dreadnought, the kind that once brought entire fleets to their knees. Dan exhaled. No wonder they want you dead. She looked away. I never wanted to fight. I just wanted to survive. Dan studied her carefully. He could see the weight she carried. The fear, the loss, the responsibility she never asked for. Finally, he stood up. Well, we're not running anymore. Alina looked up, surprised. What? Dan grinned. If that ship can take down the Vorgith, then we're going to find it. Alina's breath caught. You mean, you'll help me? Dan smirked. I didn't sign up for this mess just to back out now. Alina's eyes softened, gratitude shining in them. Dan turned to the ship's console and plugged in the coordinates from the disk. The star map lit up with a blinking marker, deep in uncharted space. He whistled. "Looks like we're going into the unknown." Alina smiled faintly. "Then let's not waste time." As the ship changed course toward destiny, Dan felt a fire burning inside him. The final battle was coming. And for the first time in history, the Vorgith would know what it meant to fear. Dan's ship dropped out of hyperspace, emerging into a dark and silent void. Before them, a massive planet loomed, cold, dead, and covered in thick clouds of dust. It had no name, just a set of ancient coordinates buried in Alina's disk. "There." Alina pointed at the surface. "The warship is hidden beneath." Dan studied the readings. No signs of life. No signals. If your people really left a dreadnought here, it's been buried for centuries. Alina nodded. The Arcanists built hidden bunkers beneath dead worlds. The ship should still be there. Dan set the ship down carefully on the barren surface. Dust swirled around them as the landing gears touched the ground. The silence outside was unnatural, almost like the planet itself had been forgotten by time. Alina checked her scanner. "There's an entrance a few meters away." Dan grabbed his blaster and opened the hatch. "Let's find this thing before the Vorgith do." They stepped onto the rocky terrain, moving cautiously. The wind howled, carrying whispers of a forgotten past. After a short walk, they found it. A massive metal door, half buried in dust and stone. Ancient symbols lined the edges, glowing faintly at Alina's touch. "This is it." She took a deep breath and placed her hand on the panel. The symbols flared to life, and with a loud rumble, the door slid open. A deep tunnel stretched below, filled with darkness. Dan pulled out a light and grinned. "After you, princess." Alina rolled her eyes but stepped forward. They moved cautiously through the underground passage, their footsteps echoing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they reached it. The Titan-class dreadnought. It lay in a massive underground chamber, covered in dust but untouched by time. Its sleek black hull gleamed under their lights. Even after centuries, the warship looked as powerful as ever. Dan let out a low whistle. "Now that's a battleship." Alina smiled. "It's the last of its kind." But before they could celebrate, the alarms blared. Dan spun around. "No, no way." Alina's eyes widened in horror. "They found us." Above them, Vorgith warships roared down from the sky. The dust clouds parted as their landing crafts descended. Dozens of soldiers emerged, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. At the center of them all, the Vorgith commander stepped forward. His red visor glowed menacingly. "There is no escape." The commander's voice echoed through the chamber. "Surrender the girl, and you may live." Dan gritted his teeth. "Yeah, I don't think so." The commander sighed. "Then you die." The battle began. Dan dove for cover as plasma blasts rained down. Alina activated the ship's control panel, trying to bring the dreadnought to life. "Dan, I need time," she shouted. Dan fired back, taking down 2 Vorgith soldiers. "Work faster." Alina's fingers flew over the controls, her heart pounding. The ancient systems booted up slowly, too slowly. The commander marched forward, cutting through the dust. His energy blade ignited, humming with deadly light. Dan barely dodged a strike, rolling to the side. He fired at the commander's armor, but the shots bounced off. "You fight well, human," the commander said, "but you cannot win." Dan smirked, despite the danger. "Yeah, watch me." Just then, the dreadnought came to life. Engines roared, lights blazed. The ground shook as the massive warship awoke from its slumber. Alina activated the defense systems. Turrets emerged from the walls, firing at the invading soldiers. Explosions erupted as the Vorgith forces scrambled for cover. Dan saw his chance. As the commander turned in surprise, Dan lunged, grabbing a fallen plasma blade. With one swift strike, he slashed across the commander's visor, sending sparks flying. The commander staggered back, stunned. Dan grinned. "Told you. Humans don't surrender." Alina's voice rang out. "Dan, get inside." Dan sprinted up the ramp as the dreadnought lifted off, rising through the collapsing chamber. Outside, the remaining Vorgith ships opened fire, but the dreadnought's shields held strong. Dan rushed to the control panel. "Alina, can this thing fight?" Alina smiled. "Oh, it can do much more than that." With a single command, the dreadnought's cannons charge, and in one powerful blast, the Vorgith warships were obliterated. Dan let out a breath of relief. "Remind me never to underestimate Arcanist tech." Alina turned to him, her golden eyes shining. "Thank you, Dan, for everything." He smirked. Well, someone had to teach the Vorgith a lesson. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, the galaxy had hope, and the Vorgith would soon learn. Humanity fights back.